Welcome to DeepDive's podcast channel. Think about this for a second. You sign up for what seems like this really intriguing psychology study. You're healthy, stable, maybe, a little curious about yourself. Not real prison, not actual danger, just a simulation. That's what they tell you. 2 weeks, and you get paid. But then something starts to shift. The roles you're playing, they start to feel, well, real. You catch yourself thinking differently, acting differently, maybe even believing differently, like someone else entirely. This is the territory of the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's a pretty stark look at how easily our sense of right and wrong can get twisted when power dynamics enter the room, and frankly, how quickly ordinary folks can step into some quite dark behavior. The central question we're really digging into today is this: what happens when everyday people are handed power within a prison environment? Our mission in this deep dive is to try and unpack the psychology of power, control, and human behavior that this study, well, it's really laid bare.
It's definitely a study that sticks with you, doesn't it? Even all these decades later. What's fascinating when you first approach it is the basic question Dr. Philip Zimbardo was asking back in 1971 at Stanford. He was digging into this really core idea in social psychology. Can the roles we take on and the systems we find ourselves in, can they become so powerful that they actually, overshadow our own personal ethics, our own sense of self?
Right, so it wasn't about trying to find people who were somehow inherently bad, was it? The focus was squarely on the situation itself, how it could shape what people did. Okay, so how did this whole experiment actually get started? What was the setup like?
Well, the way it was designed was, I'd say, quite clever, though obviously it raised huge ethical questions later on, which I'm sure we'll get into. Zimbardo and his team put out an ad looking for healthy male college students to volunteer. They got, I think, over 70 applicants, and they carefully selected 24 who seemed psychologically stable based on testing. Then came the really crucial part, and they just flipped a coin, randomly assigned these students to be either a guard or a prisoner.
A coin flip. That really drives home the point that these were just regular students, yeah. No specific background or personality trait that would predict how they'd react in that kind of pressure cooker.
Exactly. That randomness is key. The plan was for this simulation to run for 2 weeks, and they set it up in this makeshift prison they created right there in the basement of Stanford's psychology department building. Now, to really ramp up the realism from the get-go, the students assigned the prisoner role were actually arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers.
Wait, really? Actual police?
Yes. They went through the whole booking routine, fingerprinting, being put in a holding cell, blindfolded. It was a very dramatic and intentionally disorienting way to start this simulation.
Wow, that sounds incredibly jarring. It's so much more than just showing up at a lab door. That initial arrest must have instantly started blurring that line between just playing a role and, well, reality. And what about the guards? What were their instructions?
The instructions for the guards were surprisingly minimal, and that's quite revealing in itself. They were given uniforms, khaki shirts, pants, and those iconic mirrored sunglasses, specifically to prevent eye contact, to increase that anonymity. They also carried batons, though more as symbols of power initially. Their main instruction was simply to maintain order. That was basically it. It's really important to stress they were explicitly told not to use physical violence. The idea was their authority, the uniforms, the setting, that would be enough.
So, okay, you've got this random assignment, a pretty realistic, albeit basement, prison setting, and very few rules for the guards besides keep control. This is where things started to go off the rails, isn't it? What happened once the experiment actually began?
Almost immediately. The power dynamics, the roles, they started having this profound effect. The guards, remember, these are just students with no prior training, no inherent reason to dislike the prisoners. They began exerting their authority in ways that became increasingly severe. We saw them imposing arbitrary punishments, using tactics designed to humiliate and degrade the prisoners, and just constantly escalating their level of control. It really makes you think about that old saying, power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And here, with very little oversight, what was revealed was often, well, quite disturbing.
It's really unsettling how fast that dynamic seemed to cement itself. And it wasn't just the guards changing, was it? The prisoners' behavior shifted dramatically, too.
Oh, absolutely. The students in the prisoner role weren't just passively sitting there. They started to internalize that identity. They began to see themselves and each other differently, as somehow lesser, almost subhuman in the eyes of the guards, and maybe even their own. There's that famous quote from one participant, prisoner number 416. He said, "I began to feel that I was losing my identity. The person that I called Clay was gone, and I was 416. That quote just perfectly captures this idea of role identity, this powerful psychological merging with a role where it starts shaping your actions, your thoughts, your feelings, even when you consciously know it's just temporary.
That quote is chilling. It really cuts to the heart of it. It wasn't just acting. It was like a fundamental shift in their sense of who they were.
Yeah.
And those mirrored sunglasses the guards wore and the fact the prisoners were just numbers. That seems like it played a big part in this whole transformation.
Exactly right. Those elements were very intentionally designed to create what psychologists call de-individuation. By hiding the guards' faces, making them anonymous, and stripping the prisoners of their names, replacing them with numbers. It fostered this sense of being less of an individual. De-individuation is basically this reduction in self-awareness. It makes people less likely to monitor their own behavior, more impulsive, often acting in ways they wouldn't normally consider. When people feel anonymous, less personally accountable, they're more susceptible to group norms or situational pressures. In this case, that anonymity seemed to allow both guards and prisoners to more fully become what the system expected of them, rather than who they were outside those basement walls.
Okay, so you have this intense environment, power imbalances, these roles taking over, people feeling less like individuals. The whole situation just spiraled downwards incredibly fast then. It wasn't supposed to end early, was it? The plan was 2 weeks.
No, absolutely not. The plan was 2 full weeks, but the psychological deterioration was so rapid, so severe, they had to shut the whole thing down after only 6 days, less than half the intended time. Within the first 36 hours, one of the prisoners had such a severe emotional breakdown, uncontrollable crying rage that he had to be released. Then by day 4, the prisoners attempted a rebellion, barricaded themselves in their cells, and the guards' response was to become even harsher. They used fire extinguishers on them, increased punishments like solitary confinement, which was just a small dark closet. They started using basic things like sleep and even bathroom access as bargaining chips, as tools for control.
It sounds incredibly grim, especially remembering these are just ordinary college students, right?
Yeah.
In a university basement.
Sure.
And what's particularly unsettling is that Zimbardo himself, the lead researcher, seemed to get totally caught up in it too, acting like a real prison boss.
That's a really critical and often criticized aspect. Zimbardo wasn't just the researcher, he took on the role of prison superintendent within the simulation. And by his own admission later, he became deeply immersed. His focus shifted towards maintaining the prison, keeping order, sometimes seemingly at the expense of the participants' well-being. It actually took an outsider, Dr. Christina Maslach, she was a graduate student at the time, and later Zimbardo's wife, who came in to observe. She was horrified by what she saw and strongly objected on ethical grounds. Her reaction was the catalyst that finally made Zimbardo realize just how bad things had become and led him to terminate the experiment early.
Which brings us squarely to the huge ethical storm surrounding the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's famous, yes, but it's also infamous for how it was run.
Absolutely. The ethical concerns are massive, and frankly, they've permanently changed how psychological research is conducted. Some of the key issues were the lack of truly fully informed consent. Did the participants really grasp the potential intensity, the psychological risks involved? Probably not entirely. Then there's the psychological harm itself. It clearly exceeded acceptable limits for research participants. Both guards and prisoners suffered. Zimbardo's dual role, being both the lead investigator and the superintendent, created a major conflict of interest. It compromised his objectivity. And, perhaps most disturbingly, the failure to intervene sooner, even when the signs of severe distress were obvious.
It's almost impossible to imagine a study like that getting approval from an ethics board, an IRB, today. It really shows how far our understanding of research ethics has come, partly because of cautionary tales like this one.
Exactly. The Stanford Prison Experiment was a harsh lesson. It forced the field to confront the potential for harm and led directly to much stricter ethical guidelines. Now there's a huge emphasis on genuinely voluntary participation, the absolute right to withdraw at any point without any penalty, the necessity of thorough debriefing afterwards, and, crucially, the role of independent ethics committees, institutional review boards, to provide oversight and protect participants.
But despite all those serious ethical problems, the experiment did offer some really profound, maybe uncomfortable, insights into human psychology that still resonate, right? One that jumps out is obedience to authority, which kind of echoes the Milgram experiments from a decade earlier.
Yes, the parallels with Stanley Milgram's obedience studies are very strong. Both experiments dramatically illustrate how powerful authority figures and the systems they represent can be in shaping our behavior. In Stanford, we saw just how readily these students slipped into the roles and adopted the behaviors expected within that power structure, even when those behaviors were, morally questionable. When the system seems to reward certain actions, or at least permit them, and when your peers are doing it too, making it seem normal, it becomes much harder to resist, even if it clashes with your own values.
And this links into Zimbardo's later work, particularly his concept of bad barrels rather than just bad apples, which he really explored in his book, The Lucifer Effect. Could you unpack that idea a little?
Yeah, this is such a crucial takeaway, I think. Zimbardo argued quite forcefully, based on this and other research, that while individual personality does matter, the situation, the environment, the system, the barrel can be a much stronger force in driving bad behavior. The bad barrels idea suggests that flawed systems, ones with unclear rules, power imbalances, lack of accountability, toxic norms, can essentially corrupt or bring out the worst in otherwise good apples, meaning ordinary, decent people. The Stanford experiment is almost the textbook illustration of this. The prison environment itself seemed to elicit and amplify these negative behaviors, particularly in the guards. The big implication is if we want to prevent abuse, cruelty, unethical conduct, we can't just focus on blaming individuals after the fact. We have to look critically at the systems, the barrels that might be enabling or even encouraging that behavior.
That has some pretty heavy real-world relevance, doesn't it? This isn't just some, historical curiosity from a university basement.
Oh, absolutely not. We can unfortunately see echoes of the Stanford Prison Experiment in numerous real-world events. The abuses at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq back in 2003, for instance. The images and reports from there showed U.S. soldiers subjecting Iraqi detainees to humiliation, abuse, even torture. And the conditions describe poor training, unclear chain of command, high stress, a sense of us versus them. Dehumanization bears some really unsettling similarities to the dynamics Zimbardo created. But you can draw parallels to other things, too. Issues around police brutality, how people behave under authoritarian regimes, even things like corporate corruption or bullying in workplaces or schools. The experiment gives us a lens to understand how institutional structures, leadership, group conformity pressures, how all these things interact to shape behavior, for better or worse, in all sorts of settings.
It is a really uncomfortable mirror to hold up to ourselves, isn't it? We all like to think, oh, I wouldn't do that. I'm a good person. But this experiment forces us to consider that maybe our goodness is more fragile, more situation-dependent than we like to believe.
It is deeply uncomfortable. And I think that's exactly why it remains such a powerful and frequently discussed study. It pokes at fundamental questions about human nature. Who are we really when the usual rules and social checks disappear? What kind of person might I become if I suddenly had unchecked power over others? We instinctively want to believe in our own moral compass, our kindness, our decency. But the experiment strongly suggests that the wrong environment, the wrong role, the wrong pressures, they can lead ordinary people down some very dark roads.
But it's not entirely hopeless, is it? I mean, the fact that we can study these dynamics, so
Yeah.
we can understand them, that gives us some agency, right? If we know how systems can influence behavior negatively, maybe we can also work toward building better systems,
Wow.
ones that promote ethical conduct and accountability.
Exactly. That's the crucial counterpoint. Despite its disturbing findings, the experiment shouldn't just lead to despair or cynicism about human nature. It should really serve as a powerful call for awareness. We need to be constantly vigilant about the power dynamics in any system we're part of, our workplaces, our communities, our political structures. We need the courage to question authority, especially when it seems unchecked or when things feel off. And most importantly, we have to remember that while systems shape people, ultimately, people create and sustain those systems. That awareness, that sense of shared responsibility, that's our best defense against the kind of dehumanization and abuse of power that the Stanford Prison Experiment brought so chillingly into focus.
That's a really important and actually quite empowering thought to end on. Thank you so much for walking us through this complex and troubling but incredibly significant piece of psychology history.
My pleasure. It's a conversation that remains vital, I think.
And for all of you listening, we hope this deep dive into the Stanford Prison Experiment has given you some food for thought about the powerful influence of situations and roles on all of our behavior. We definitely encourage you to maybe reflect a little on your own potential reactions within different kinds of systems or roles you might encounter. It's certainly something worth considering. If you found this discussion valuable, please do subscribe, like, and maybe click that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive.